The courtroom in Abilene, Kansas had never seen anything like it. Not in the summer of 1878, not ever. The ceiling fan stirred the thick August air into something barely breathable, and every seat in the gallery was packed with ranchers, farmers, railroad workers, and townsfolk who had ridden in from 3 counties away just to witness what everyone assumed would be a foregone conclusion. Cornelius Vance, the most powerful rail baron west of the Mississippi, sat at the defendant's table with the comfortable arrogance of a man who had never once lost anything he wanted to keep. His attorney, a silver-tongued Harvard man named Alastair Pemberton, shuffled papers with practiced ease. Behind them, a small army of Vance's hired men filled the gallery rows, their presence a quiet threat that every single person in that room could feel. And then Hazel Cooper walked through the door. She was 27 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of absolute determination, wearing a deep blue dress that had seen better days but sat on her like armor. Her dark auburn hair was pinned up precisely, and she carried a leather satchel so thick with documents it made the brass clasp strain against its rivets. She walked down the center aisle without hesitating, without looking at Vance, without acknowledging the low murmur of shock that rippled through the gallery when people realized she was heading for the plaintiff's table. Alone. No attorney beside her. Just herself and that satchel. Cornelius Vance turned in his chair and looked at her. He said nothing, but the smile that crossed his face was the kind that men with unlimited power reserve for people they consider amusing obstacles. He had bought judges. He had bought sheriffs. He had bought United States senators. He had buried 3 separate legal challenges to his land seizures in the past 4 years, each one filed by men with more resources than this woman appeared to have. Whatever this journalist thought she was doing, it would be over before lunch. What Vance did not know, what almost nobody in that courtroom knew except for one person sitting in the back row watching with dark, careful eyes, was that Hazel Cooper had not walked into that room to lose. She had walked in carrying a legal brief that had taken her 14 months to construct, a document citing 47 separate violations of the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, the Homestead Act, and 3 specific provisions of Kansas state land law. She had cross-referenced every deed, every forged signature, every bribed county clerk, every displaced farm family across 160 miles of stolen frontier territory. The brief was 63 pages long, and she had written every single word of it herself. The man in the back row was Edwin Walker. He had ridden 60 miles through a dust storm to be here, and he was watching Hazel Cooper the way a man watches something that has just fundamentally rearranged everything he thought he understood about the world. 6 weeks earlier, none of this had existed yet. The confrontation, the courtroom, the catastrophic gamble that Hazel had staked her career, her safety, and in at least 2 genuine instances her life upon. 6 weeks earlier, there had been only a woman riding alone into the town of Millhaven with a press credential from the Topeka Weekly Tribune tucked into her coat pocket, and a secret mission that her editor did not entirely know the full scope of. Millhaven, Kansas sat at the edge of the new rail corridor that Cornelius Vance's Continental Western Railway had been cutting across the southern plains since 1875. It was a town of about 400 souls, a good half of whom were living in a state of quiet terror. Vance's surveyors had been moving through the surrounding territory for months, staking claims to land that families had been homesteading for a decade. When the official notices arrived from the county land office, the homesteaders discovered their deeds had somehow been superseded. The county clerk, a man named Gordon Pratt who had been in that position for 11 years, had been quietly replaced by a man nobody knew named Douglas Fitch, who had arrived in Millhaven 6 months before the railway surveys began. Hazel had caught wind of the story through a letter sent to the Tribune by a schoolteacher named Martha Hensley, who taught the children of 3 farming families that had already been forcibly removed from land they had worked for 8 years. The letter was intended for the letters section of the paper. Hazel had intercepted it on her way to the typesetter and spent the next 2 days cross-referencing it against railway expansion reports, federal land office filings, and a congressional record that she had been quietly accumulating for years, because Hazel Cooper had not become one of the only female staff journalists west of St. Louis by covering church picnics and county fairs. She covered land fraud. She covered corporate corruption. She covered the systematic theft of frontier land from the people who had broken their backs building it. It was a beat that had already earned her 3 death threats and one very determined attempt to destroy her professional reputation by planting a false story under her byline, an attempt that had failed because Hazel had anticipated it and had taken the precaution of having her editor keep a signed affidavit of her actual filed copy in a bank lockbox. She arrived in Millhaven on a Tuesday morning in late June, 1878, riding a bay mare named Clara who was steady and reliable and had carried Hazel across more miles of Kansas prairie than either of them cared to count. She checked into the Millhaven Hotel, which was clean and respectable and charged a fair rate, and she spent the first afternoon simply walking the town, listening. A journalist's most powerful tool, she had always believed, was not a pen. It was patience. It was on that first afternoon, standing at the counter of the general store while waiting to purchase paper and ink, that she first heard Edwin Walker's name. 2 farmers were talking in the corner, not quietly enough. One of them said that Edwin Walker had tried to talk sense to Vance's man last Thursday and been told in clear terms what would happen to his ranch if he kept making noise. The other farmer said that Edwin Walker was not the kind of man to be told anything, and that the trouble was going to get worse before it got better. Hazel noted the name and kept moving. She spent the next 2 days conducting interviews, which was a somewhat generous term for what were often terrified, whispered conversations held in back rooms and haylofts by people who were genuinely afraid of what Vance's men might do if they were seen talking to a journalist. What she learned was systematic and damning. Douglas Fitch, the replacement county clerk, had been filing amended deed registrations backdated to 1871, effectively claiming that the original homestead filings had contained procedural errors that voided them under a narrow provision of Kansas territorial law. It was an obscure provision, almost certainly crafted for exactly this kind of abuse, and it required a legal challenge to overturn. The problem was that every lawyer within 100 miles who had the competence to mount such a challenge had either been retained by Vance's company as a conflict of interest poison pill, or had quietly received a visit from men who expressed concern for the lawyer's continued good health. On her 3rd evening in Millhaven, Hazel was sitting in the hotel dining room with her notes spread across the table, eating a plate of beef and potatoes that she was largely ignoring because the pattern in her documentation was beginning to align into something that was not merely a newspaper story. It was a legal case, a serious one. She was deep in this realization, cross-referencing dates with her thumbnail pressed to her lip in concentration, when the chair across from her was pulled out and someone sat down in it without asking. She looked up. Edwin Walker was 32 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with 32 years of actual physical work. He had dark hair cut short under a trail-worn hat that he had removed before sitting, which Hazel noted as a mark of decent upbringing. His eyes were a particularly clear shade of brown, the kind that tended to see more than they let on. He had a scar along his left jaw from what had obviously been a fence wire accident at some point in his past, and his hands on the table were the hands of a man who used them. He was not handsome in the way of portraits or dime novels. He was handsome in the way of things that are built correctly and have proved it. He said without preamble, "You are the journalist from Topeka." Hazel put down her pen. "I am. You have been talking to people in this town for 3 days. I have. And you are going to write something about Vance's railway." Hazel studied him for a moment. She said, "You are Edwin Walker." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He said, "How do you know that?" "Because you just walked in here and sat down across from a woman you do not know, without asking, with the specific purposeful energy of someone who has something to say, and has been working up the nerve to say it. Which means you are either a man who does not believe women require basic courtesy, in which case this conversation is going to be very short, or you are someone who wanted to talk to me specifically and was urgent about it. Given your ranch is the one Vance's surveyors flagged last week as the next acquisition target, I am going to assume you are the latter." Edwin Walker stared at her for a long moment. Then he said slowly, "Who told you about the surveyors?" "I am a journalist. Telling you my sources is not part of the arrangement." She picked up her pen again. "What did you want to say?" There was a pause. It was the pause of a man who had expected something different, something more manageable, and was rapidly adjusting his expectations. He said, "I wanted to say that writing a newspaper article is not going to stop Cornelius Vance." "I know that," Hazel said. "Then what are you planning to do?" She looked at him directly. The dining room was mostly empty now, the last of the evening patrons drifting toward the door. The lantern light on the table between them was the amber of late summer evenings, and it caught the real depth of his attention in a way that Hazel found herself unexpectedly conscious of. She said, "I am planning to destroy him legally, completely, and permanently. The newspaper story is the mechanism, not the weapon." She paused. "What I need is someone who knows this land. Someone who has been here long enough to know the original boundaries of every homestead that has been fraudulently refiled. Someone who can ride with me through the eastern corridor and help me document the physical markers, the fence lines, the water rights evidence that predates Vance's surveys by years. I need someone the other homesteaders will talk freely to." Edwin was quiet. Then he said, "You are describing a job that is going to put a target on your back." "There is already a target on my back," Hazel said, with the matter-of-fact calm of someone who had long ago made her peace with that particular reality. "I have been doing this work for 6 years. I am still here." He looked at her for another moment. The recalibration was happening again, deeper this time. He said, "What makes you think you can take on Cornelius Vance and win? 3 lawyers have tried. He has bought every court between here and Wichita." Hazel set her pen down again. She reached into her satchel and produced a thick sheaf of papers. Not all of them, not even close to all of them, but enough. She spread them on the table. "Federal court," she said. "Not county, not state, federal. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 grants specific protections to homestead claims that predate railway charters by more than 3 years. Vance's charter for this corridor was filed in 1874. The earliest of these homesteads was filed in 1869. That gap is the crack in his entire structure, and nobody has exploited it because nobody has done the research to prove the original filing dates against the backdated amendments in the county records." She tapped the papers. "I have done the research." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Edwin Walker looked at the papers on the table. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was not what she would have expected, not skepticism or condescension or the particular brand of uncomfortable surprise she was used to seeing in men's faces when she demonstrated competence. It was something more honest than that. It was the look of someone seeing something clearly for the first time. He said, "You are serious." "I am always serious," Hazel said. He picked up one of the pages and read for a moment. His reading was not performative. He read carefully, following the citations with his finger. After a minute he set it down. He said, "You would need testimony from the original homesteaders, witnesses." "Yes. Some of them have left the territory, fear." "I know. I need to find them." He was quiet again. Outside, the sounds of Millhaven's evening came through the walls, a dog barking somewhere, the distant percussion of a piano from the saloon 2 streets over, the dry Kansas wind moving dust along the main road. Finally, Edwin Walker said, "My ranch is the one you mentioned, the one they surveyed last week." "Yes. I have been here for 9 years. I built that place from nothing. 320 acres, and every inch of it is mine. Yes. And you think you can stop them from taking it? Hazel said. I think we can stop them from taking all of it, from taking everyone's, but I need your help to do it. That was the beginning of it. Not the romance, not yet, that would come in the strange, compressed, high-stakes intimacy of the weeks that followed. But the alliance, the dangerous, improbable partnership between the most stubborn journalist in Kansas and the rancher who had 9 years of frontier grit and a very personal stake in seeing Cornelius Vance stopped. They started the next morning, riding out before dawn to beat the heat. Edwin knew the land in the way that only someone who has worked it every day for years can know it. Not just its geography, but its character, its specific personality. He knew which draws flooded in spring and which held water all summer, which ridgelines the old-time settlers had used as natural fence breaks, which stands of cottonwood marked the original property corner stakes that had been driven in 1869 and 1870 by families who had walked this land before there was a single mile of railway within 300 miles of it. Hazel rode Clara at an easy pace beside him and wrote everything down. She had a reporter's notebook in her coat pocket and a larger survey document in the saddlebag, and she moved between them with the efficiency of someone who had developed her own system and refined it over years of field work. Edwin watched her work and said nothing judgmental about it, which was something she noticed and filed away. He was not the kind of man who needed to comment on everything a woman did. What he did say, on that first morning, as they were examining the boundary markers of a farm belonging to a family named Kellerman who had been displaced 3 months prior, was, "You know how to read a survey marker." It was not a question. He had watched her crouch beside the stone cairn at the field's edge and read the chiseling on the capstone with the practiced eye of someone who had done it 100 times. She said, "I spent 2 years working with a land surveyor in Missouri before I came to the Tribune. He needed a field assistant, and I needed to learn something useful." Edwin said, "Most journalists who come out here know how to write about land disputes. They don't know how to read the land. Most journalists who come out here are not trying to build a federal case," Hazel said. She brushed the dust off her hands and stood up. "The inscription here is dated August 1869. I need you to tell me if there is anything in your memory of this property that confirms the Kellermans were here before that date." Edwin said, "Old Jacob Kellerman showed me his original government land patent when I was first negotiating the water-sharing agreement on our shared creek. It was dated June 1869. I remember because he made a joke about the patent arriving on the same day his youngest was born." Hazel wrote this down. She said, "Where is that patent now?" "Kellerman took everything he could carry when Vance's men came. He and his family are in Dodge City. We need to go to Dodge City." Edwin looked at her. "That is 2 days' ride." "Then we should leave tomorrow morning," Hazel said, already walking back to where Clara was tethered. He caught up to her in 3 long strides. He said, "You cannot ride to Dodge City alone. Vance has men on the road." Hazel paused. She turned to look at him. She said, "I was not planning to ride to Dodge City alone. I was planning to ask you to come with me. But if you have other obligations, I will manage." The look on his face was something between admiration and something more complicated. He said, "I will come." They rode back to Millhaven in the early afternoon heat, and that evening they met at the hotel dining room again, this time with a map spread between them that Edwin had brought from his ranch, a detailed hand-drawn survey of the entire corridor that he had been updating and maintaining for the past 3 years as a record of his own property. The map was extraordinary. Done in pencil and ink with careful, methodical precision, it showed not just property lines but water sources, seasonal features, access roads, the locations of every homestead structure within a 10-mile radius, and notations in Edwin's precise, spare handwriting about the history of each parcel. Hazel stared at it for a long moment. She said, "You made this yourself?" "Over 3 years," Edwin said. "I started it when I first heard rumors about the railway charter, I thought if it came to a fight, evidence would matter." She looked up at him. Something shifted in her chest, a warm, unexpected recognition of a mind that worked the way her own did, proactively, strategically, against a threat before it materialized into something unstoppable. She said, "This map is going to be a central exhibit in the federal case." "If you can get it there," Edwin said. "I will get it there," Hazel said. The look they exchanged over the map was brief, but it was the look of two people who have just recognized something essential in each other. It was not the look of romantic love yet. That would come later, built on the slow accumulation of trust and witness, the way genuine love between two real people tends to be constructed, not in lightning strikes, but in layered moments of genuine seeing. They left for Dodge City before sunrise the next morning. The road was long and the Kansas summer was merciless, and by the time they had been riding for 3 hours, the heat was a physical presence, pressing down on the flat land with a weight that made conversation seem like an act of will. But they talked anyway. First about the case, about strategies, about the specific provisions of the Pacific Railway Act, and the ways in which Vance's legal team had exploited gaps in enforcement. Then, gradually, because long rides across flat country have a way of stripping away social formality, about other things. Edwin asked her how she had become a journalist. Not the polite version of the question, not the version that was really asking whether she should be allowed to do it, but a genuine question about how she had arrived at this specific path. She told him. She had grown up in eastern Missouri, the daughter of a printer who had taught her to read type backward and to love the weight and smell of ink. She had been writing for her father's paper since she was 12, starting with notices and corrections, working her way to local features, and then to longer investigation pieces when a series of land fraud cases in her county had given her what she recognized instantly as her subject. After her father died, when she was 21, she had sold the press and come west because the West was where the land fraud was, where the biggest stories were, where the consequences of corporate greed were most immediately felt by the most vulnerable people. Edwin listened without interrupting. At the end he said, "You did not come west to find a husband." Hazel laughed. It was a genuine laugh, full and unguarded, and it surprised her slightly because she did not often laugh freely with people she had only known for a few days. She said, "No, I certainly did not." He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and the effect of it on his face was something she did not entirely have words for, except that it made something in the architecture of her usual careful composure shift slightly on its foundations. She looked back at the road ahead and said, "Why did you come west?" "I was 19, Edwin said. "My father had a farm in Ohio that was never going to be large enough to divide between 4 sons and still feed anyone. I drew the short straw and I went first." He paused. "Then I got here and there was this land, just this enormous rolling land that went on forever, and I understood something I had not understood before." "What?" "That the world was bigger than I had been told it was." Hazel looked at him sideways. She said, "And yet someone is trying to take it from you." "Someone is trying," Edwin said. "He has not managed it yet." They rode in silence for a moment. A hawk described a long, slow circle above the grass to their right, hunting. The sky was enormous and cloudless and purely, ferociously blue. Hazel thought about the documents in her saddlebag, the dates and signatures and legal citations that she had been accumulating for weeks, and then she thought about Edwin Walker's hand-drawn map with its 3 years of careful, solitary record-keeping. And she felt a quiet but powerful gratitude for the specific strange fortune that had put them in the same room at the same time. They reached Dodge City late the following afternoon, dusty and tired and grateful for the town's relative shade and the prospect of a proper meal. They found the Kellermans in a boarding house on the south side of town, Jacob and his wife and their 2 youngest children, looking like people who had been startled out of their lives and had not yet recovered the shape of them. Jacob Kellerman was a large, raw-boned, German-born man of about 50, with hands that showed 40 years of farm work and eyes that showed several months of grinding helplessness. When Edwin walked through the door, Kellerman's face changed in the particular way that faces change when something familiar and trustworthy appears out of a landscape that has become foreign and frightening. They embraced briefly, the way men of that era and region embraced, tight and brief, and loaded with the freight of everything they did not say. Hazel introduced herself and explained what she was building. She was direct about it because being indirect with displaced homesteaders was, in her experience, an insult to their intelligence. Kellerman listened to her with the focused attention of someone who had nothing left to lose and was trying to understand whether this was a genuine prospect or another disappointment. Then Hazel opened her satchel and laid out what she had: the survey comparisons, the dated documents, the pattern of fraud she had traced across the entire corridor. Kellerman's wife, a spare, practical woman named Hannah, came to the table and began reading without being invited to, and after a few minutes she said in a flat, quiet voice, "This is everything that happened to us." "Yes," Hazel said, "you can prove it. I can prove enough of it to take it to federal court, but I need your original land patent, the government-issued document from 1869. Edwin tells me you took it when you left." Kellerman looked at his wife. She went to a trunk in the corner of the room. She lifted a false bottom that had been built into it and removed a cloth-wrapped package. She brought it to the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a government-issue land patent, incon vellum, dated June 1869, signed and sealed by the appropriate Federal Land Office authority. Hazel's hands were very still on the table. Her voice was steady when she said, "May I photograph this document?" "You have a camera?" Kellerman asked. Hazel produced a small field camera from her satchel, a compact wet plate apparatus that she had learned to use specifically for document work. It was perhaps the single most valuable piece of equipment she owned, and she had carried it across more miles of frontier than the manufacturer had probably intended for it. Edwin, watching from across the table, said nothing. But his expression, which had been open and attentive throughout the conversation, settled into something deeper. He was watching her work with the camera, the steady, practiced economy of her movements, the way she positioned the document and calculated the light without hesitation. And she would not realize until later, falling in love with her competence in that specific, inarticulate way that some people fall in love, not with the surface of a person but with the substance of them. They spent 2 more days in Dodge City, interviewing 3 other displaced families who had fled there from the corridor. Each one produced documents. Each one told the same story from a different angle. Hazel photographed everything, transcribed testimony into her notebook, cross-referenced dates with the documents Edwin had brought from his own records. By the time they left Dodge City on the 3rd morning, her saddlebag was so full of evidence it was pressing against the buckles. They rode back mostly in silence, but it was the comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and do not need to perform conversation. On the 2nd afternoon of the return ride, a thunderstorm built up out of the southwest with the spectacular speed of Kansas summer weather, the sky going from brilliant blue to a particular shade of greenish-black in what seemed like 20 minutes. The wind came first, carrying the smell of rain and something electric. Edwin said, "We should find shelter." Hazel looked at the sky with the experienced eye of someone who had been caught in Kansas storms before. She said, "There is a cottonwood draw about a mile northeast. It will give us cover for the horses. You know this country. I mapped the whole corridor before I came to Millhaven, from Federal Survey records." He stared at her for exactly 1 second and then said, "Lead the way." She did, and they made the draw with about 5 minutes to spare before the storm hit with the full force of a Kansas cloudbreak, rain driving sideways through the cottonwood leaves above them, while the horses stood against each other with their backs to the weather and Edwin and Hazel pressed against the bank, with her oilskin spread over both of them against the worst of the rain. They were very close together in the way that circumstances rather than intention sometimes arranges people. She could feel the warmth of him through the oilskin. The storm was loud enough that conversation required proximity. He said near her ear, "How did you know about this draw?" She said, "I told you, I mapped it." He said, "From records. From records and from writing it myself. 3 years ago, before the railway rumors started properly, I came through this corridor on a different story. I make it a rule to know the physical geography of any territory I am investigating." He was quiet for a moment with the rain hammering down around them. Then he said, "That is the most prepared thing I have ever heard." She turned her head slightly and found that his face was closer than she had calibrated. His eyes, that clear particular brown, were looking at her with an expression that was direct and honest and contained something that made her own breath come slightly differently. She said, keeping her voice level, "I have found that preparation is generally the difference between a story and an obituary." He said, "I am glad you are prepared, Hazel." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix. She registered it. She did not comment on it. She turned back to watching the rain. But she was aware, with the precision of someone who notices things for a living, that something had changed between them. Not dramatically, not in any way that either of them would have acknowledged aloud in that moment. But the oilskin pressed between them against the storm felt less like a matter of practical shelter, and more like something they were choosing, and neither of them shifted away from it until the storm passed. They returned to Millhaven on the following afternoon to find that the situation had escalated in their absence. 2 more homestead families had received final notices from the county land office. More than that, a man named Roy Casper, who was Vance's regional enforcer, had come through Millhaven with 3 of his riders asking questions about the journalist from Topeka and who had been seen talking to her. Edwin's ranch hand, a young Mexican man named Louis Reyes who had been working the Walker property for 4 years, met them at the road into town with this information delivered quickly and quietly. He also told Edwin that Casper's men had ridden out to the Walker ranch while Edwin was gone and had examined the fence lines in a way that made Louis and the other hand deeply uncomfortable. Edwin's jaw set in a way that Hazel had not seen before. He said, "Did they touch anything?" Louis said, "But they looked at the corner stones." Edwin looked at Hazel. She looked at him. She said, "We need to move faster." Back in her hotel room that evening, with the door locked and a chair under the handle as a precaution she had developed years ago, Hazel spread everything out on the floor. Every document, every photograph, every page of testimony. She began assembling the legal brief in earnest, working from the structural framework she had been developing in her mind for weeks. She had studied law informally but systematically, borrowing and purchasing every text she could access, corresponding with 2 lawyers she trusted, one in Kansas City and one in Washington, who had provided her with guidance on the technical structure of federal pleadings without knowing the full scope of what she was building. She worked through the night. Occasionally she heard footsteps in the corridor and went still and listened until they passed. She wrote with the focused intensity of someone who has been preparing for a single defining moment and recognizes that the moment has arrived. By the time the sky outside began to lighten from black to deep gray, she had 40 pages. Edwin came to the hotel at 7 in the morning with coffee and food from the dining room. He knocked twice, paused, then once more, the signal they had agreed on. She opened the door. He looked at her face and the papers on the floor and the ink stains on her fingers, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he came in and set the food down and looked at the floor. He stood there for a long time, reading what she had written, crouching to turn pages and examine documents. The silence was complete except for the sound of the town waking outside and the occasional sound of him moving papers. After 15 minutes he stood up and turned to her. He said, "This is extraordinary." Hazel, who had sat down on the edge of the bed because she had been awake all night and her legs were expressing opinions about that, said, "I still have 20 more pages to write." "This will work," Edwin said. "This is actually going to work." She looked at him. There was something in his face that was beyond admiration, something that had moved into a territory that was both more personal and more honest. He said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "Tell me." He sat down in the chair by the window. He said, "When you first sat down in the dining room and I walked over, I thought you were going to be another person writing a sympathetic article that would change nothing. I thought I was going to have to manage your expectations politely, and then go back to managing this situation the way I have been managing it, which is to say not very well and mostly alone." Hazel said, "And now," he said, "and now I think you are the most capable person I have ever met, and I am fairly certain you are going to change things." A pause. "And I think I owe you an apology for every assumption I made in the first 30 seconds of knowing you." Hazel looked at him steadily. She said, "I am used to those assumptions." "I know," Edwin said. "That does not make it right." She held his gaze for a moment. Something warm and complicated was moving through her chest. She said, "Thank you, Edwin." The way he looked at her when she said his name was the way the land looked after the kind of rain that broke a long, dry spell. The next 10 days were the most dangerous of the whole enterprise. Roy Casper's men were a constant presence in Millhaven, and twice Hazel was followed on her way between the hotel and the post office, where she was mailing copies of her documents to her contact in Kansas City for safekeeping. She dealt with this with the practical calm of someone who has been in dangerous situations before. She varied her routes. She kept her most critical documents on her person rather than in her room, and she arranged with Edwin to meet each evening at the hotel dining room for dinner, partly for the safety of being seen publicly with a local landowner of standing, and partly because the dinner hour had become something she looked forward to in a way that was no longer entirely professional. Edwin recognized this shift too. It showed in small ways. He began arriving at the hotel dining room 5 minutes early rather than on time. He remembered her preference for coffee over tea without being asked. He found reasons to extend the work conversations into territory that was not strictly work. Questions about Missouri, about her father, about what she planned to do after the case was resolved. He asked these things with a directness that was characteristic of him, but that had acquired a new quality of personal interest that was unmistakable to someone who was in the habit of noticing things. One evening, after a day that had included a tense confrontation on the main street with Roy Casper himself, who had stopped Hazel outside the hotel and offered her a substantial sum of money to leave Millhaven, which she had declined in 3 words and 2 very steady seconds of eye contact, Edwin had held her chair at the dinner table for a slightly longer moment than necessary. His hand had been near her shoulder without touching it, and she had felt the warmth of his presence there with a clarity that had nothing to do with temperature. She had said, sitting down, "You do not need to protect me, Edwin." He had sat across from her and said, "I know you do not need protecting." "I am not trying to protect you." A pause. "I am trying to be near you." Hazel had looked at her coffee cup for a moment, then she had said, "That is a different thing." "Yes," Edwin said, "it is." She had looked at him then directly and without the professional composure she maintained so carefully. She said, "When this is over." He understood. He said, "When this is over." It was not a declaration exactly. It was an acknowledgement of something that was already true, deferred only by the immediate and serious reality that they were in the middle of something that required their full attention and could still go badly wrong. The legal brief was completed 11 days after they returned from Dodge City. It was 63 pages, as previously noted, and it was one of the more impressive documents ever assembled by a non-lawyer in the history of Kansas jurisprudence, a fact that would later be noted by the federal judge who received it. Hazel's Kansas City contact, the lawyer named Thomas Barrett, received the copy she mailed him, read it, and sent back a telegram that said only, "This is sufficient. File it." The filing itself required a trip to the federal court office in Wichita, which was the nearest federal venue. Hazel and Edwin rode there together over 2 days. Roy Casper's men followed them for the first half day and then, apparently satisfied that they were simply traveling, fell back. This was, Hazel knew, because Casper had underestimated the brief. He knew she was a journalist. He did not know she was also, by necessity and preparation and years of deliberately acquired knowledge, functioning as her own legal counsel. In Wichita, Hazel filed the brief at the federal court clerk's office on a Wednesday morning. The clerk, a thin man named Harper who had worked in that office for 20 years, received it with the routine detachment of someone who processed dozens of filings a week. He began reading the cover page, then the summary, and then his hands on the paper slowed. He looked up at her. He looked back down. He read for another full minute. Then he said, "Who prepared this brief, ma'am?" Hazel said, "I did." Harper looked at her for a moment. Then he stamped it with the date and the court seal and said in a tone of genuine respect, "This will be assigned to Judge Calvin Holt. He is in court through next week. You will receive a hearing date by post." The hearing date came faster than anyone expected, because Judge Calvin Holt read the brief himself that same afternoon and set the matter for a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. Cornelius Vance, upon being served, reportedly threw the brief across his hotel suite, and then, after his attorney Alastair Pemberton had spent an hour reading it, reportedly went quite still and said nothing for a long time. The 3 weeks before the hearing were a study in escalating pressure. Vance's people tried 3 separate approaches to making the case disappear. The first was financial. A representative arrived at the hotel and offered Hazel a sum of money that was, by any objective measure, enough to live on for the rest of her life. She showed him the door. The second was reputational. A story appeared in a Wichita newspaper claiming that Hazel Cooper had fabricated sources in a previous investigation, a claim that was both false and, as it happened, identical in structure to the attempt that had been made on her reputation 2 years earlier, the one she had anticipated and neutralized with the signed affidavit in her editor's bank lockbox. She sent a telegram to her editor, who sent back the relevant documentation, which Hazel forwarded to the court as evidence of witness tampering, which added 3 more pages to her case. The third approach was the most serious. Roy Casper came to Edwin Walker's ranch on a Thursday afternoon with 6 men, and a piece of paper claiming that an emergency court order had been issued vacating the Walker property, pending the resolution of Vance's prior claims. Edwin read the paper in the doorway of his ranch house, took his time about it, and then looked at Casper and said, in a very quiet voice, that he would need 2 hours to verify the court order's authenticity before he complied with anything, and that if Casper attempted to remove him from his property before that verification was complete, Casper would be in violation of his own legal obligations. Casper was not a man accustomed to being responded to this way by people he was threatening. He made several remarks that were not kind. Edwin did not react to any of them. Casper left with his men, and Edwin immediately rode to the nearest telegraph office and sent a message to Thomas Barrett in Kansas City, who verified within 4 hours that no such court order existed and that the paper Casper had presented was a forgery. This forgery became the 4th exhibit in the witness tampering addendum to Hazel's case. The night before the hearing, they sat together in the hotel dining room in Abilene, where they had ridden 3 days before to be in place. The room was quiet. The town felt different at this proximity to something that mattered. Hazel had her notes in front of her, but she was not reading them. She was looking at the lantern flame, which was doing the particular thing that candle flames do when there is a faint draft, moving in small arcs of light. Edwin said, "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. She said, "Not of the hearing. I know what I have built." A pause. "I am afraid of the space after it." He said, "What do you mean?" She looked at him. She said, "For 14 months I have had this as my purpose. This case, this fight, these people whose land was stolen. It's been everything." She set her pen down. "When it is over, I will need to remember who I am outside of it." Edwin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are the most complete person I know. You do not need a purpose to define you." She looked at him with such directness that for a moment the distance between them seemed like an oversight rather than a choice. She said, "Edwin." He said, "Yes. I said I would tell you when it was over. You did. It is not over yet." "No," he said. "It is not." But his hand moved across the table and covered hers, and she let it stay there. They sat like that for a few minutes, with the lantern between them and the quiet town outside, and it was one of the simplest and most honest things either of them had experienced in a very long time. The morning of the hearing came with the particular brightness of a Kansas August, the sky white-hot at the edges and deepening to cobalt directly overhead, the courthouse filling up with people who had heard about this case through the network of whisper and frontier telegraph that moves news through small communities faster than any newspaper. Hazel arrived first, which was deliberate. She arranged her documents with the careful precision of someone who has organized and reorganized them enough times that the arrangement is perfect, and she knows it. She was calm in the specific way that people are calm when they have done everything that can be done, and the moment of reckoning has arrived. Edwin sat in the back row of the gallery. They had agreed that this was the appropriate arrangement. Her at the plaintiff's table representing herself and the homesteaders who had given her their authority, him as a witness and a presence in the gallery, available if needed. He wore a clean shirt and his best coat, and he sat with the stillness of someone containing a very large amount of feeling behind a very controlled exterior. And then Cornelius Vance arrived, and the room changed in the way that rooms change when a certain quality of power and arrogance enters them. He was a large man, well-fed and expensively dressed, with the florid complexion of someone who has spent considerable time at tables where the food and drink are excellent. He moved to the defendant's table with the practiced ease of a man who had stood in rooms like this one many times, and had always walked out of them in better shape than he had entered. Behind him came Alastair Pemberton with his Harvard manner and his expensive briefcase and the cool, assessing eyes of a lawyer who had earned his reputation. Pemberton looked at Hazel sitting alone at the plaintiff's table and said something quietly to Vance that Hazel did not hear but whose general content she could calculate from context. Vance glanced at her and produced the smile she had been expecting, the one that said he found this amusing. Judge Calvin Holt entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, a compact, white-haired man in his late 50s, whose reputation for rigor and impartiality was as solid as any federal judge on the frontier circuit. He had been on the bench for 22 years. He had read Hazel's brief twice before this hearing, which was not standard practice but which the brief had warranted. He called the session to order and looked at the plaintiff's table and said, "Miss Cooper, you are representing the plaintiffs in this matter and appearing as your own counsel." Hazel said, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Holt said, "The court has reviewed your brief. Are you prepared to present your case?" Hazel said, "Yes, Your Honor." Alastair Pemberton rose immediately and said with polished smoothness, "Your Honor, with respect, the court should note that Miss Cooper is not a licensed attorney and the brief she has filed, while impressive in its research, raises questions of standing and proper form that," Judge Holt said without expression, "Mr. Pemberton, sit down." Pemberton sat down. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in the room. Holt said, "The plaintiff has standing as a party in interest through the assignments of right she has properly filed with this court from the displaced homesteaders. The brief is in acceptable form. We will proceed." He looked at Hazel. "You may begin." What followed over the next 5 hours was one of the more extraordinary legal proceedings in Kansas federal court history, not because it was theatrical, but because it was not. Hazel Cooper presented her case with the disciplined, methodical precision of someone who knew every document in her satchel intimately, who could cite by date and page number every relevant provision of every relevant statute, and who had anticipated every counterargument that Pemberton raised and had documentation prepared for each one. Pemberton was good. He was genuinely excellent at his profession, and had an intelligent strategy that focused on procedural challenges to the homesteaders' original filing dates, arguing that the county clerk's amendments had been made under proper authority. Hazel dismantled this argument by producing the appointment records for Douglas Fitch, the replacement clerk, and demonstrating that his appointment had been made by a county commission that was itself improperly constituted under Kansas law at the time of the appointment, rendering every action he had taken as clerk legally void from the beginning. Pemberton produced a certified copy of the Continental Western Railway's federal charter. Hazel produced a competing analysis, sourced from the congressional record and authenticated by Barrett in Kansas City, demonstrating that the charter's easement provisions contained a specific carve-out for pre-existing homestead claims that predated it by more than 36 months, and that the homesteads in question met that threshold. Pemberton called for a continuance. Judge Holt denied it. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Pemberton had stopped trying to win the argument on its merits and had shifted to procedural delays, which told Hazel everything she needed to know about how he assessed the case. By 4 o'clock, Vance had stopped smiling. At 4:30, Judge Holt called a recess and retired to his chambers. He returned 20 minutes later with 2 pages of written preliminary findings that he read into the record in his precise, flat voice. He found that the evidence presented demonstrated probable cause to believe that systematic fraud had been committed against the plaintiff homesteaders in violation of the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, and 3 provisions of Kansas state land law. He found that the appointment of Douglas Fitch as county clerk was of questionable legality and would be referred to the state attorney general for investigation. He issued a preliminary injunction halting all further Continental Western Railway land activity in the corridor pending full trial proceedings. He ordered the original homestead pats to be reinstated pending the same, and he referred the matter of the forged court order presented to Edwin Walker's ranch to the United States Marshal for investigation of criminal fraud. The gallery erupted. Not in celebration exactly, not yet, because everyone in that room understood that a preliminary injunction was not a final victory. But the eruption was of the kind that happens when something impossible has shown signs of being possible, when the fixed and immovable has moved. At the defendant's table, Cornelius Vance sat very still. His face had a quality that Hazel had seen before in powerful men, when they first understood they were facing something they could not simply overpower. It was not defeat yet, but it was the beginning of the realization that defeat was a real option, perhaps for the first time in his professional life. Pemberton leaned close to Vance and said something in a low voice. Vance said something back. Pemberton looked at the papers on the table and said something else. Vance said, in a voice that carried despite being quiet, "Find a way." In the back row of the gallery, Edwin Walker stood up. He was looking at Hazel across the courtroom. She had turned from the judge's bench and was collecting her documents with steady hands, and when she looked up and found his eyes across the room, something passed between them that had no legal terminology and required none. The days that followed the preliminary hearing were not peaceful. Vance did not accept the injunction with anything approaching grace. Pemberton filed 3 separate motions challenging the injunction on technical grounds, each of which Judge Holt dispatched with a brevity that suggested he found them unpersuasive. Roy Casper and his men were pulled back from the corridor, not because Vance ordered it graciously, but because the United States Marshal's investigation of the forged court order had created a situation where their visible presence was a legal liability. Hazel remained in Abilene to manage the continuing legal proceedings, working with Thomas Barrett, who had now come from Kansas City in person after reading the preliminary findings, which he described to her in their first meeting with an expression of combined admiration and honest disbelief. He said, "Where did you learn to do this?" she said. "From reading and from necessity." Barrett said, "You know I will have to argue the full trial proceedings," she said. "I know. I will be your primary researcher and co-counsel in everything but name." He looked at her for a moment and said, "If this territory ever joins the modern world, Miss Cooper, they are going to have to let women pass the bar." Edwin rode back to his ranch to manage the property in the aftermath of the injunction, but he came to Abilene every week, sometimes twice a week, to bring Hazel documents she needed and to share meals with her in the hotel dining room in the evenings. The quality of those dinners had changed. The work was still present, but it had given way to something more primary. He brought her wildflowers once, which she thought about for a long time afterward. Not roses from a florist, which was not something that existed in Abilene in 1878 in any practical sense, but prairie wildflowers that he had picked along the road that morning. They were the purple coneflowers and yellow goldenrod that grew abundantly on the Kansas plains in August, and he put them on the table between them with a matter-of-fact simplicity that made the gesture both more and less than it would have been if it had been elaborate. She said, "Edwin," he said, "they were there on the road." She picked up a coneflower and looked at it. She said, "You are very good at caring about things without making a performance of it." He said, "Is that a compliment?" She said, "Yes, it is the specific kind that means I trust you." That evening, after dinner, they walked along the main street of Abilene in the early evening cool that followed the August heat, and it was the kind of walk that has no practical purpose and both parties know it. At the end of the street, where the town faded into the open grassland beyond, they stopped and looked at the sky, which was doing the thing that Kansas skies do at that hour, presenting a horizon of pure, uninterrupted color running from deep rose at the west to violet at the zenith, with the first stars showing in the east. Edwin said, "When this is fully over, when the trial is done and the land is returned and you have filed your story and done everything you came here to do." He paused. "I would like to ask you something," Hazel said, "then ask me now." He turned to look at her. He said, "I would like you to stay, not because of the case, because I want you to stay." Another pause. "I know you are a journalist and I know this is your work and I know you do not need anything from me. I'm not asking because I think you need something. I'm asking because—" He stopped. She said quietly, "Because," he said, "because I have never in my life met a person who made me feel like the world was larger and more worth fighting for just by being in the same room. And I do not want to go back to a life without that." The sky above them was doing that impossible thing. The stars were multiplying. The grassland stretched away to the south in the last of the light, enormous and ancient and alive. Hazel said, "I do not stay places, Edwin. I follow the work." He said, "I know that." She looked at him. She said, "But I have been thinking for several weeks now that if I were to stop following and try staying somewhere, this would be the place." A pause. "And you would be the reason." He looked at her with everything he had not said in the weeks since that afternoon in the hotel room when he had covered her hand with his. She looked back at him with the same completeness, and this time there was no deferral, no agreed-upon future timing. He stepped toward her and she did not step back. And when he kissed her, it was with the same quality that characterized everything else about him, direct and genuine and without performance. And she returned it with the same quality that characterized everything about her, fully and without reservation, and with the particular warmth of someone who had been careful for a very long time and had made a deliberate choice to stop being careful. The trial of the Continental Western Railway's land acquisition practices in the Kansas corridor took place in October of 1878 before Judge Calvin Holt in the federal court in Abilene. Thomas Barrett argued the case with Hazel's full 63-page brief and the additional 2 weeks of research and witness preparation she had completed in the intervening months. Roy Casper had, by this point, been indicted by the United States Marshal on charges of criminal fraud related to the forged court order and several other matters that had emerged during investigation, and had declined to appear as a witness for either side on the advice of his own attorney. Douglas Fitch, the fraudulent county clerk, had been relieved of his position by the state attorney general's investigation and was facing his own charges. Cornelius Vance arrived at the trial with Pemberton and a second attorney from New York named Cavendish, who had the look of a man accustomed to winning in larger arenas. He was still large and florid and expensive, but the smile had been replaced by something more careful. The trial lasted 4 days. Barrett was excellent. The evidence was overwhelming. On the 4th day, after closing arguments, Judge Holt retired for deliberation. He returned with his full findings the following morning. They were comprehensive and unambiguous. The Continental Western Railway had engaged in systematic fraud in its acquisition of the corridor lands. The amended deed registrations filed by Douglas Fitch were voided in their entirety. The original homestead patents were fully reinstated. An injunction was issued permanently barring the Continental Western Railway from acquiring the contested lands or interfering with the reinstated homesteaders' occupation of them. The matter of criminal fraud charges against Cornelius Vance personally was referred to the federal prosecutor, whose investigation would proceed separately. In the gallery there were people weeping. There were people embracing. Jacob Kellerman, who had ridden up from Dodge City for the verdict with his wife and their family, sat very still with his head bowed and his large hand covering his face for a moment. Hannah Kellerman's hand was on his shoulder. Cornelius Vance, hearing the verdict read, looked across the courtroom at Hazel with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not hatred exactly. Something more like recognition. The specific look of a man who has just understood that he was wrong about something that he considered a fixed and permanent truth, namely that women like Hazel Cooper could be ignored or managed or bought off or frightened into silence. She met his gaze steadily. She did not gloat. Gloating was not her style, but she did not look away. In the back row of the gallery, Edwin Walker exhaled slowly, the release of a breath that had been held for 14 months. Afterward, in the brief, brilliant chaos of the courthouse steps, where journalists who had followed the trial were pressing Hazel for comments, and the reinstated homesteaders were surrounding her with a gratitude so intense it had lost the capacity for words, Edwin stood at the edge of the steps and waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned that about himself over the course of these weeks in relation to this woman, that waiting for her was nothing like waiting in general. It had a direction and a warmth to it that made it feel like something other than time passing. She came to him when she had answered the last of the questions, and thanked the last of the homesteaders and shaken Barrett's hand, and survived Jacob Kellerman's enormous, careful embrace. She came to him in the afternoon light on the courthouse steps, and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and he held her, solid and real and certain. And she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and allowed herself, for the first time in 14 months, to be still. He said against her hair, "You did it." She said, "We did it." "No," he said quietly and without false modesty. "You did this. I helped where I could. This was yours." She pulled back enough to look at his face. She said, "You believed it could be done when almost nobody else did." He said, "I believed in you." In the weeks that followed, life in the corridor was not instantly resolved into peace and prosperity, because real life does not work that way, and Hazel would not have wanted a story that pretended it did. The reinstated homesteaders returned to their properties to find months of neglect, fences down, crops unsown, structures damaged by weather, and in a few cases by deliberate vandalism during the period of Vance's occupation. The criminal investigation of Vance proceeded slowly through the federal system, as such investigations always did. Douglas Fitch's trial was scheduled for the following spring, but the land was returned. That was the essential thing. The Kellermans went back to their farm and began the work of rebuilding it with the matter-of-fact determination of people who have been through worse and come out the other side with their fundamental selves intact. Other families returned. The corridor, which had been silenced by fear for the better part of 2 years, began to make the sounds of human habitation again, the sounds of work and daily life and children. Hazel wrote the full account for the Topeka Weekly Tribune in a three-part series that was subsequently picked up and reprinted by newspapers in Kansas City, St. Louis, and Chicago, and that generated more correspondence than anything the Tribune had published in its history. The editor, a practical man named George Homan, who had always appreciated Hazel's work while being privately somewhat terrified by its scope, wrote her a letter that contained the sentence, "I am not certain whether you are the most dangerous journalist I have ever employed or simply the best, and I suspect the answer is both." She showed the letter to Edwin one evening at the ranch, where she had been staying in a guest room that had, by common tacit agreement between them, taken on the quality of a permanent arrangement rather than a temporary one. He read it and laughed, a full and genuine laugh, and she found herself thinking that his laugh was one of her favorite sounds in the world. She had taken to riding with him in the early mornings before the heat came. They rode the property together, checking the fences and the water lines and the cattle, and she was learning the particular language of ranch work the way she learned most things, by asking questions and paying attention, and Edwin taught her willingly and without condescension. She, in return, was teaching him to think about legal documents and public records in the way she thought about them, as a language that could be read and used by anyone willing to learn it, not only by lawyers and their wealthy clients. One morning in late November, with the first bite of Kansas winter in the air and the grass gone tawny, and the sky the deep cerulean of cold days, they were riding along the eastern boundary of the property when Edwin stopped his horse at the corner stone he had been documenting for 9 years. He dismounted and crouched beside it, and Hazel came and stood beside him and looked at the inscription, which she had memorized during the first weeks of their work together. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He looked up at her from where he crouched, with the particular vulnerability of a large, capable, self-contained man who has decided to be honest about wanting something. He said, "I want to marry you, Hazel, not because it is expected or because it would be convenient or because the ranch needs a woman, because I want to spend my life next to someone who sees things the way you see them, and fights the way you fight, and loves the way I believe you love, which is completely and without reservation once you decide." Hazel was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like distant water. Somewhere in the air above them a meadowlark was singing the particular two-note call of the cold season. She said, "I have not stayed in one place for 6 years." He said, "I know," she said. "My work takes me away from here sometimes, perhaps often. I cannot promise otherwise." He said, "I know that too," she said. "You would need to understand that I will not give up the work, not entirely. Perhaps the most dangerous parts of it, perhaps, as time goes on. But the work itself, Hazel," he said, quietly and with complete seriousness. "I fell in love with the work right alongside you. I am not asking you to stop being who you are. I am asking you to be who you are here with me as much and as often as the work allows." She looked at him for a long moment, this man kneeling beside a corner stone that he had protected with 9 years of careful, solitary record-keeping, this man who had covered her hand with his across a dinner table, and waited for her with the patient certainty of someone who knew what they were waiting for. She thought about the storm and the cottonwood draw and the wildflowers on the dinner table, and the way he had looked at her across the courtroom in the moment of the preliminary injunction. She said, "Yes." He stood up. He was taller than her by a full head, and he looked down at her with something in his face that made the November cold irrelevant. He said, "Yes." "Yes," she said again. "I will marry you, Edwin Walker." He kissed her there at the corner stone of his property, with the winter sky enormous above them and the land stretching away in all directions under the cold light, and it was one of the best moments that either of them had ever had on a piece of ground. They were married in December of 1878 in the church in Millhaven, which was a small clapboard building that held about 60 people and was filled beyond capacity. Jacob and Hannah Kellerman were there, and Louis Reyes, and Thomas Barrett, who had ridden from Kansas City specifically to attend. George Holman sent flowers and a letter that made Hazel laugh. Several of the reinstated homesteaders came with their families, and the general mood of the gathering was that quality of relief and celebration that comes when a community has survived something that was intended to destroy it and has gathered to mark the fact of its survival. Hazel wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made with Hannah Kellerman's help over 3 weekends in November. Edwin wore his best coat and a new shirt and looked extremely uncomfortable for about 10 minutes, and then forgot to look uncomfortable because he was too occupied with watching Hazel walk down the church aisle toward him. And something in his face in that moment was so openly honest that several people in the gallery had to look away because they felt they were seeing something private. The Reverend Hartwell performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a frontier minister who had other services that afternoon. And then Edwin kissed his wife, and the 60 or more people in that small building made a noise entirely disproportionate to their number. The winter settled over the Walker Ranch with the deep, particular quiet of Kansas January, white fields and clear cold air, and the long nights that in warmer months seemed excessive, but in winter had the quality of gift time. Hazel established a small desk in the front room of the ranch house, beside the window that faced east, where the light was good in the mornings, and she wrote from there. She continued her correspondence with the Tribune, and with contacts in Kansas City and Chicago who were beginning to commission pieces from her on federal land law and the ongoing consequences of the Railway Expansion Acts. The Cornelius Vance criminal case moved forward through the federal system, and she followed it carefully and wrote about it, because it was a story that deserved to be fully told. Edwin ran the ranch with the steady competence that had characterized the previous 9 years, but with a quality added to the days that had not been there before, a company and a conversation, and a partnership that extended beyond the work into every room of the house and every hour of the day, in ways that he had not known to expect, and that mattered enormously. In the spring of 1879, the criminal trial of Cornelius Vance opened in the federal court in Topeka, the largest city in Kansas and the seat of state government. Hazel attended as a journalist and as a witness, giving testimony about the documents she had assembled and the pattern of fraud she had documented. She sat in the witness box in that courtroom with the same steady competence she had carried into every room and every situation in the preceding 14 months, and her testimony was precise and complete and devastating to the defense's case. Vance was convicted on 11 counts of federal fraud and conspiracy. He received a sentence of 7 years in federal prison and a financial penalty that represented a substantial portion of the Continental Western Railway's operating assets. The railway itself, restructured under new management, eventually completed a revised corridor route that did not require the seizure of any homestead land, because the new management had reviewed the Walker case and concluded sensibly that attempting to replicate Vance's approach was not a viable business strategy. Roy Casper was convicted separately and received 4 years. Douglas Fitch received 2 years and was permanently barred from public office. The Topeka Weekly Tribune ran Hazel's full account of the verdicts on the front page under a headline that read, "Justice for the Plains, the fraud that failed, and the journalist who stopped it." George Holman sent Hazel a personal letter with the printed page enclosed and a note at the bottom that said, simply, "Our best work. Congratulations." She showed Edwin the newspaper at the breakfast table on a warm April morning, with the windows open and the smell of the newly thawed ground coming in from the fields. He read the front page without rushing and then set it down and looked at her across the table with a smile that had become, in the months since their marriage, one of the central comforts of her life. He said, "Our best work," he says. She said, "He means the paper's best work." Edwin said, "He is not wrong, but he is not entirely right either. I think the best work is ongoing." She looked at him. She said, "Is it?" He said, "I believe so. We are just getting started." The summer of 1879 brought with it a heat wave and 3 new story commissions for Hazel from papers in 3 different states, which was the kind of professional recognition she had been working toward for years, and which she received with the satisfaction of work that has earned its reward. It also brought the news that she had been expecting for a month and had been waiting to be certain of before telling anyone. She told Edwin on a Sunday evening in July, in the kitchen after dinner, in the direct and unadorned way she told him most things. She said, "I am going to have a baby." Edwin set down the cup he was holding. He looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise and into something so much deeper that it had no clean name, something composed of joy and tenderness, and the particular gravity of a man understanding that his life has just changed in the most fundamental possible way. He said, very quietly, "When?" she said. "January, I think. Perhaps February." He came around the kitchen table and held her in a way that was different from other ways he had held her, careful and enveloping and full of the specific feeling of someone who is aware of holding something that matters beyond measure. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the deep, warm steadiness of him, and thought that this was perhaps the best version of any life she could have imagined for herself. This strange and improbable combination of the work she had chosen, and the man who loved her because of who she was, and the land that had provided the stage for all of it. The baby was born in February of 1880, a strong and healthy boy whom they named Thomas Edwin Walker, the Thomas being for Barrett in Kansas City, who had been an essential part of the fight that had made this life possible, and who wrote back upon being informed of the naming honor with a letter that was notably uncharacteristic for a lawyer in its emotional directness. Young Thomas was a baby of strong opinions and vigorous physical expression, which suggested to Edwin that he had inherited certain qualities from his mother, and which Hazel found she could not argue with. He grew through his first year with the particular speed of healthy children, becoming in his second year a very small person with dark hair and clear brown eyes, the brown of his father's eyes in combination with a watchful quality that was unmistakably his mother's. Hazel continued her work, adapting it as mothers adapt things without surrendering them, writing from her desk in the morning while Thomas slept and conducting longer research trips in the autumn when Edwin could take primary care of the ranch and Louis Reyes, who had expanded his role to something approaching foreman, could manage the day-to-day operations. Edwin never asked her to reduce the work, and she never asked him to pretend the ranch was not his primary obligation, and this mutual respect for what the other had built before they found each other was, they both came to understand, the architecture of a marriage that worked. In 1881, the Kansas legislature passed a new Land Protection Act that incorporated several of the specific provisions that had been central to the Walker case, including tighter restrictions on county clerk appointments and stricter authenticity requirements for deed amendments. The act was largely driven by the documented evidence that had come out of the Vance trial, which was itself largely built on the brief that Hazel Cooper Walker had assembled in a hotel room in Millhaven over 14 months. The day the act was signed into law, Hazel was sitting at her desk reading the telegraph announcement when Edwin came in from the fields. She showed him the telegram without saying anything. He read it and then sat down in the chair across from her with the look of someone receiving news that has arrived exactly when it was earned. He said, "This is because of you." She said, "This is because of the homesteaders who stayed, and the ones who kept their documents, and the ones who were willing to trust a journalist from Topeka who arrived in town asking questions." "And because of the journalist from Topeka," Edwin said. She smiled. She said, "And because of a rancher with a hand-drawn map who sat down across from a woman he did not know and decided to believe she could do the impossible." In 1882, Thomas was 2 years old and exploring the world with a thoroughness that required nearly constant attention and provided nearly constant entertainment. and Hazel discovered in the early autumn that she was pregnant again. This time she told Edwin on a morning ride, the two of them out along the eastern boundary with the sunrise ahead of them and the grass still silver with dew. And his reaction was the same quality of deep joy it had been the first time, unperformed and wholly genuine. Their second child was born in the spring of 1883, a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady brown eyes, whom they named Frances, after Hazel's long-deceased grandmother, who had been a woman of strong character and practical brilliance in her own era, and deserved to have her name carried forward. The Walker Ranch in those years was a place of particular, earned happiness. It was not a life without difficulty. Ranching was hard and the frontier remained demanding, and the world's tendency toward injustice did not disappear because one specific case had been won. Hazel continued to write about land fraud and corporate malfeasance, and the ongoing struggles of frontier families against the concentrated power of money, and some of her reporting continued to generate controversy and occasional threats, which she handled with the same calm practicality she had always applied to them. But there was a rootedness to things now that had not been there before, an understanding of where home was that made the work both more purposeful and more sustainable. She went back to it because she chose to. She came home because she wanted to. Those were different things from what her life had been before, and they were better. Edwin Walker remained the kind of man he had always been, solid and direct and capable of a tenderness toward his family that was expressed in actions rather than declarations, in the fence fixed before she had mentioned it needed fixing, and the coffee made before she was awake, and the way he looked at Thomas and Frances when he thought nobody was watching. He was a man who had built something from nothing in a landscape that asked everything of you, and who had been surprised, as the best people sometimes are, by the discovery that the right person appearing in your life does not reduce what you have built, but expands it into something larger than you knew to want. The case became known in Kansas legal history as Walker v. Continental Western Railway, which was not entirely accurate since Hazel had built and filed the case and was the primary driver of the proceedings, but which reflected the practical reality that Edwin's ranch had been the central documented example of the fraud. Hazel found this attribution mildly amusing and entirely typical, and she noted it in the memoir she began drafting in 1884, a detailed account of the case and the methods she had used and the people whose courage had made it possible. The memoir was published in 1886 by a Kansas City press that had been trying to acquire it for 2 years. It sold well, went through 3 printings in the first year, and was used as a reference in several subsequent federal land fraud cases. In the acknowledgments, Hazel wrote, "To Edwin, who sat down across from me and believed in what I was building before I had finished building it, and who has spent every year since proving that the rarest quality in any person, man or woman, is the willingness to recognize strength in another without feeling diminished by it." Edwin read the acknowledgment at the kitchen table when the first copy arrived in the post, and Thomas, who was 6 by then and learning to read at a pace that suggested he had inherited certain qualities from both parents, climbed onto his father's knee and tried to read over his shoulder. Edwin held the book in one hand and his son with the other arm and read the paragraph twice, and then looked across the kitchen to where Hazel was standing at the stove and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, his face carrying everything in it clearly enough. She looked back at him with the same completeness. 2 people who had found each other at the edge of a fight and had emerged from it into something neither of them had been looking for and both of them had needed. Outside, the Kansas spring was doing what it did, enormous and indifferent and gorgeous, the sky extending in every direction to the edges of the world, the grass coming up green after the winter, the meadowlarks making their careful, clear claims on the air. The land that had been fought for was occupied and worked by the people who had earned it. The injustice had been answered by the law and by the woman who had understood the law well enough to make it answer. Young Francis was in the yard chasing a chicken with the total conviction of a 3-year-old who believes this is both possible and necessary. And Louis Reyes, who had become family in the way that people who share years of work and loyalty become family, was watching from the fence with the smile of someone who has seen this particular futile pursuit many times before. The ranch was alive with the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of a life being lived well. And inside the kitchen, with the first copy of her book on the table and her husband's eyes on her face, Hazel Cooper Walker thought of all the road that had brought her here and felt, with the clarity that she brought to everything she thought, that all of it had been worth it. Every mile and every risk and every threat and every night of writing by lamplight until her fingers cramped, and every moment of quiet fear that she had managed carefully and moved through, because there had been something worth moving toward. Not just the justice, though the justice mattered beyond measure to every family that had been returned to their land, but this, the desk by the window with the morning light. The man who had believed her, the children who carried both of them forward into a future that was open and enormous and theirs. That was worth everything. That was the whole of it.